Okay, this is something I'm really excited to announce. I'm gonna do the 2025 motorcycle Trans Am cross-country ride on this century-old Harley-Davidson. Now the Trans Am ride is next September. It starts in Nags Head, North Carolina and rides 4,000 miles to the California coast. So I scored this bike from a friend of mine, and more about that later, but he bought it at the Mecum auction and it needs a lot more than he thought it needed. This is a 1927 Harley-Davidson JD with a 1929 JD engine in it. I am going to take this from a old man's bike, basically from an original old man's bike, to a custom, like what people would have ridden in the 1950s. In the 1950s, this bike would have been 20 plus years old. So this would have been what you would have bought for $50 in the 50s and chopped it, customized it, and rode if you didn't have the money for a panhead or a knucklehead. Still really fast bikes. I've got some tricks up my sleeve for this, but I'm gonna make a very cool custom bike out of this. So watch what I do. I'm gonna strip the fenders off of it and sell them. I'm gonna put a custom bobber rear fender on it. I'm gonna get rid of the seat and put a real low seat on it. I'm gonna get rid of the handlebars and put some Flanders handlebars on it, like what they would have done in the 50s. I'm gonna get rid of the gas tanks and put a set of replica tanks on it, just so I can make this ride without having to worry about these junkers leaking on me. I do a bunch of other really cool tricks to it, so follow along. This is a 1929 engine. I'm gonna pull it out. You know, it turns over, you can make it run, but you know, it needs a lot of work. I have two really nice engines that don't need work that I can put right in and get running real quick, so I'm gonna use one of those. So I'm gonna go ahead and pop this engine out. I'm just gonna sell this. I have a couple extras, I don't really need it, you know, and I know people are looking for them, so I'm gonna put this one for sale and let it go. Use one of my better engines to ride cross country with. So there she is. I got a 29J motor out of the frame. Okay, so I'm picking up a little progress on the 1929 Harley-Davidson JD that I'm gonna ride on the motorcycle Trans Am this summer, cross country from the East Coast to the West Coast. This bike was basically an original bike. I'm stripping it down and kind of building it in a bobber style that would have been done in the 50s. You know, this was like a poor man's bike in the 1950s. You know, by 1950, this thing was over 20 years old and obsolete. It has a 19-inch front wheel on it. It has a 20 on the back. You just can't run them that way. They look horrible. So I'm going to put a 20-inch front wheel on it. The wheel I bought hasn't showed up yet, so I'm going to steal a wheel from another bike right now and put it on here. And that'll right away show you kind of the stance and the lines of the bike. I'm going to go ahead and pop my rebuilt 1929 engine in it. I sold the engine that was in it. I got rid of it just because it needed so much. So I'm going to put my 29 engine in it. I'll start setting up the rear fender with a 1930 style shrouded rear tail light. The Flanders bars, you know, you're gonna really see that bobber style pop out of this thing real quick and give you a real contrast to the way the bike left the factory originally, left Milwaukee originally. They were great looking bikes, but the way I'm gonna do it, just super cool, you know, timeless custom lines. So this wheel's off of a different motorcycle. It's off of a Henderson 4-cylinder, but it's the same rim and dimension, a little bit different tire that I'm gonna run on it, but it kind of gives you an idea. I'm gonna go ahead and put it in the vise here. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and lift this 29 motor up in here, get it bolted in loose, and then I'll get everything tightened up once I get it in there and kind of situated. I got the rebuilt 1929 engine in the motorcycle. I got my left side gas tank on, and I got my fender sitting on the rear wheel with the tail light and the seat. You can kind of get a feel for the bobber vibe I'm going with here. So my next step is to get the rear fender mounted. I'm using a 1930s shrouded tail light here. I'm gonna silver solder that onto the fender with the tag and tail light bracket. Then I'm gonna use a replica Harley-Davidson Knucklehead rear fender mount. I'm gonna remove these rear fender brackets and just use this top bracket. I have to rebend this top bracket, remake it to fit the fender. What I like about it is that it's riveted. It's got the old original styling to it. So when I put it on the bike and it's all done, it's gonna look like it came from the factory that way, but then I'm gonna have the nice custom fit of the fender the way I like it, the seat the way I like it. The bike just takes on a whole new look, especially on the ground. Once I roll it outside, you see this thing on the ground, you're really gonna get it. Okay, check out how I do this. This will get you where you need to go every time when it comes to doing a fender. I take a seamstress tape and I pull it to the edge of the fender at any given point, and I measure the fender. So my fender measures 7 3/4. So that means the middle of my fender is gonna be 3 7/8 of an inch on my tape. I'm just gonna mark my fender at 3 7/8 in a few spots. Then with a piece of masking tape, I'm just gonna go ahead and go along those marks and lay my tape down. And then I run a line along it with the Sharpie. And that just gives me a real good indication where my center line is. Then using the center line I just drew, I'm gonna lay my taillight at the very tip of the fender because that's how far back I want it, and mark it where I need to be. Then I'll go ahead and mark these 2 holes and get them lined up. So I got my marks on here for where my light needs to go. I'm gonna go ahead and drill those holes and bolt this thing down, and that'll position the shroud because the shroud rides over top of the light. So the shroud's gonna go over top of the light like this. So once I get the light on, that'll tell me exactly where I need to mount the shroud on the fender, then I can prepare the fender for this piece. I'm gonna use a step drill to drill these holes. I'm gonna mount this taillight to the fender, and you gotta kind of get it so that it sits level because the mount is flat, but the taillight's rounded. So as you tighten the bolts down, it's gonna wanna pull the taillight from side to side. So I gotta kind of get it on there right so that I can get the shroud on right. There's the fender with the taillight mounted on it, and it's centered and really level. And I can show you what the shroud looks like if I put the shroud on it. The shroud's a really sweet touch to it. I gotta dolly the shroud down a little bit to make it fit this fender right because I'm gonna silver solder it and have a nice seam here. I'll show you how I dolly that, solder this on and get this ready to go. It's gonna look beautiful on that JD. Now for my next step, I'm gonna go ahead and install the license plate. Just because I know this seems kind of silly, the license plate actually part of the lines of the bike because it hangs off the back of the fender. So it's kind of in a weird way an extension of the fender. So I'm gonna go ahead and get this mounted on here a little bit, just so that when you look at it from the side, you can see the real lines of the bike the way it's gonna be when it's in service. I've talked about this in my other videos before, especially the videos on Blow and my 1946 WR Racer that I did, but the relationship between the gas tank, the seat, the fender, the handlebars is really critical. I mean, you can take the same parts and give them to 4 different people and you're gonna get 4 different orientations of those parts, and they're all gonna look different. But to me, it's critical. So you gotta make your practical considerations first before you work on your looks. So I can't run my fender way back down here. This taillight should be way down horizontal like that. That's how it runs on a Knucklehead or a VL or RL, you know, anything from the 30s. But I can't run it like that because this fender fits the tire so tight that when I go to adjust the chain and move the wheel back, the wheel's gonna interfere with the fender. So ideally, I'd run it up here. The problem with that is, I don't need any room back here to ride a passenger because I probably seldom ride a passenger on the JD. So ideally I would run the fender here. The problem with that is the taillight's too vertical. And you could run it that way, and some people probably would, but I'm not gonna run it that way. And one of the biggest reasons is, this bike has lines that are working with each other, and if I do that, the lines work against each other. Look at the carburetor cover on the carburetor. See how it goes up at an angle? All the other lines are kind of going down. The handlebars are going down. The frame rail is going down. And you have the primary line coming up, and you have the carb cover line coming up, and then you have the tail light. The tail light is like the dominant thing on the bike. And so I need to roll it back just a little bit so that it picks up the line and really kind of jives with the carburetor cover. I know the carburetor cover seems like a minor part, but even if that wasn't on there, you still need this line on the back of the bike to be at a reasonable angle. And where I had it with the fender at 12 o'clock is just too much. So I'm gonna move that back to about 1 o'clock. 2 o'clock, I think, you know, probably right there would be too much, but about 1 o'clock orientation on there I think looks really good. Getting this angle right does so much for the bike. I mean, it's a statement. It says, you know, like, I don't belong here, but I'm here, one. And then two, it makes it look fast when it's just standing still. It gives the bike a really muscular look because the lines are descending, going all the way back, and then bam, all of a sudden back here you've got something that is a statement. It's the tail end of the bike, it's a statement. And the license plate has to be on there because even though it hangs over the back of the fender like an inch and a half, it's critical because when that's on there, it changes the lines of the bike if I take it off. I look at it and it just moves my eye in a different way. I'm gonna go ahead and make the front mount for the fender and the rear fender brace modification first and get that on. Then I'll come back and silver solder this shroud on lastly because I wanna make sure it's lined up when the fender's mounted on the bike. The front fender is going to mount with these two bolts here going through the frame. And the original fender would normally ride right up against the frame. You see I've got about an inch space in here. And the reason is the original fender rode way up off the tire. And I've got my fender slammed on the tire. It's like really close. So I need to make up the space here. I'm going to make a bracket that's welded to the fender and makes up the space between this frame forging and the fender. So I'm going to measure my bolt spacing, drill a piece of flat steel strap, and then weld a bracket together that will make up this space. All right, I'm gonna use this piece of steel strap to make my fender bracket. I'm gonna go ahead and descale it real quick. All right, my bolts are 1.125 inches apart. That's 1 1/8. So I'm gonna go ahead and mark the bracket off. Center punch to where the holes are gonna be and get ready for drilling. I use my scribe to mark 9/16 on either side of the center line, which gives me 1 1/8 of spacing total. And a little sweetness with a center punch and a hammer. All right, now I'm going to clamp and cut. Now I rolled up a t-shirt. I'm going to put this t-shirt over the tire and use that to space my fender off the tire because you don't want the fender riding right on the rubber tire. You need some space there. So I'm going to use that as kind of a faux spacer. With that grinder, just make a little contour in that bracket so I don't have to gap weld that fender. I got to make sure that I have an equal gap all the way around the tire between the fender on both sides. I got to make sure the fender's centered in the rear. That's really important. I got to make sure my bracket lines up with my center line on the fender. And don't forget that t-shirt's under there, so you might start to see a lot of smoke. That thing's probably gonna want to try and catch on fire, but I'll pull it out and deal with that when the time is right. I've removed the t-shirt that I had underneath the fender. Now I'm gonna go ahead and weld the bracket to the fender fully without having to worry about catching that thing on fire. The trick is to keep the heat in the bracket and not the fender. So if you're a TIG welder, you're going to cast your heat into the bracket and just roll your torch up on the fender and bring your puddle across the seam like that. I've got a bending setup set up here on my Sigmund table. I've got a stop right here. I'm using an external expanding collet from my lathe as my bending buck or bending die, because this is a little bit smaller diameter than what I want to bend my fender strap. But when I bend it, it's going to spring back some. So I'm kind of compensating for that by using a smaller bending die. So here's my piece of steel strap, and I've left a whole bunch of material in it just to give me some leverage for bending. And I'm going to go ahead and give this bend a try and see if I can be successful at it. My center is almost lined up. That was a pretty darn good guess. But I've left too much material on this side where I'm hitting the floor as I bend. You can't see it because it's out of frame of the camera. I'm gonna go ahead and cut this and continue my bend. All right, now I've cut that short. I'm gonna come back and retry this bend. Now, since I cut this off, I don't have the kind of leverage on it. So I'm gonna go ahead and cheat. And this is a little cheat code here, but you put a pair of oversized channel locks on it, and that'll give you that kind of effective length that you need. And see how that springs back. So it's bigger than my die, but not by much. All right, so the goal was to get this strut. I knew I was never gonna get it to match the radius of the Fender because the Fender has a compound radius to it. So I knew it was never gonna match, but what I needed to do was get this strut to where it will fit inside the Fender so that I can match it to the Knucklehead strut that's on the bike. I can graft these two together and have ultimately one strap that works to get the Fender to fit the bike properly. My bending buck trick worked. I'm gonna go ahead and mark this strut on both sides where I want to cut it. I've marked the middle and measured from the middle to each cut. I got my top section of my fender brace bent. Now I'm gonna go ahead and cut the top of this strut off. I gotta rebend a little bit and get these rails closer to the tires so they line up with my brace. I'll set everything all up, I'll clamp it together, and then I'll weld. I'm gonna cut a little high first so that I have leverage to bend with, and then I'll cut to my proper length. You can see I'm way too high right now. And like I said, I'm leaving extra material. This is gonna drop down. I'm gonna graft these together, have myself a nice fender brace here. I got the top section of my strut held to the bottom section with a little metal spring clip from the office. That little thing's work pretty good. I'm gonna go ahead and tack weld here. The tack weld will allow me to make sure I got everything in alignment. Then I'll go ahead and tack on the other side. I'll get everything tacked together and then do my full weld procedure. There's my little tack weld. And so there's the strut. You see how closely it fits the tire, but that's because the fender fits real close. I've got the two sections on the right side of the bike clamped together. Now I'll just mark with my Sharpie, remove this overlapping piece, weld together here, and I'm ready to finalize the strut. Right, so there's the fender mounted with the modified Knucklehead strut. If you look right here, you can see I still got to trim this down so this is all alignment. It looks like one piece. I got to finish weld the back sides of it. So I'm going to take it all apart. The last thing I got to do before I take it apart is I'm going to pull the taillight shroud off. And I got to drill a hole in here and put a bolt that goes through the center of the fender to mount the fender to the strut. Once that's done, I can solder the shroud back onto the fender. So the way I find where that hole needs to be drilled is I just lay my tape across the fender, going from side to side, from one strut to the other. I've already got my center line picked, so right there at the intersection where the tape and the center line cross is where I want to drill my hole. And I'm not going to drill all the way through the fender strut. I'm just going to make a mark on it with the tip of my drill bit so I can take it off and drill it. I got to grind off the heads of these rivets on the inside of the bracket so I can get these rear fender hinge struts removed. There's the rivet knocked through on the old strut, and there's one that came all the way out. All right, so these flanders handlebars I'm using on the JD have internal throttle on the right-hand side of the bar and internal spark advance on the left side of the bar. This advances and retards the magneto spark to the engine. So there's a spiral here. I don't know if you can see it in that light, but it has a spiral inside. But these are long and the flanders bars are short, so you can see that where this stock Harley-Davidson spiral goes on the bar, there's a huge difference in length. So I'm gonna go ahead and cut these down in the lathe. What I do is I put this up on the handlebar. I'm gonna measure the depth inside, and whatever this depth measurement is in here, I'm gonna cut that off of this sleeve here, and then these will fit the handlebars. I'm at 1.745 inches depth here, so I'm gonna cut just a hair more than that off so that there's no friction on the end of the handlebar sleeve against the nut that holds it on. There's my throttle sleeve chucked up in the lathe. I've got my parting bit set up in the lathe. I'm just gonna switch this sucker on and ease my parting bit into the part. It's gonna be hot, can promise you that. There's my cutoff. I'll deburr it, install it, and there you can see my spiral on the inside that moves my throttle and spark advance cables. So there's my shortened spiral. Go ahead and slide it up on here and tighten up this end nut. And if it cuts right, you get a nice rotation without any end play, which is what I got. There's not a lot of brass on this bike, but there's a few things. The handlebar risers are brass. I'm gonna make some nice brass hand grips for these spirals, but that's a whole nother video. That's like a full day's worth of work to make those. So in the meantime, I'm gonna use some hockey stick grip tape, which is what they would use, something very similar for racing purposes. For a night when the wife gets mad at me and kicks me out of the house or tells me to sleep on the couch, I'll come in and do that. Show you how I make a cool little custom part for a motorcycle that you'll never forget. Can't even tell you how excited I am about the 1929 Harley-Davidson JD bobber that I'm building for the motorcycle Trans Am this summer. Cross country from the Atlantic Ocean and the Carolinas to the California coast. What a transition to this motorcycle. I love the deco styling that they have when they left Milwaukee. But the way I have this JD set up is the way I like to ride it. True outlaw style from the 1950s. This is what you would have rode if you only had $100 to buy a motorcycle and couldn't afford a Knucklehead or a Panhead, which was brand new at the time. By the 1950s, this was a 20-year-old motorcycle, very affordable, considered obsolete, really nobody wanted them. Real cold here in Nashville, Tennessee. Snow floors are starting to fall from the sky. I'm done with this thing until after Daytona Bike Week. Once I get back from Bike Week, I'm gonna go ahead and do the exhaust pipes, get the right side gas tank mounted on it, do a few small things that I'll walk you through, and this thing's ready to go to paint. Timeless deco lines on the JD. Even though the front fender is deco styled, I took it off and the bike actually looks a lot better without it because of the 20-inch wheels. But you've got that 1930s Harley-Davidson deco taillight sticking up there on the rear fender. It really mimics the lines of the ducktail from the seat. Just great lines on this thing. The Flanders bars pull it all together for the 1950s styling. One of my favorite things about the JD is these front fork rocker friction shocks from Competition Distributing. If you got a JD, you better get a set while they have them. I think they make them for the big twin springers also, for Knucklehead, Panhead, Flathead, but they're really, really cool. Just something you don't see every day. I've got one of my best linker carburetors on there, my best set of rectangular footboards. I can hardly wait to get a full set of fuel and oil tanks on this thing and get it painted. Thanks for watching. Thanks for hitting like and subscribing. I appreciate that.